David Raether was living his dream as a comedy writer in Hollywood, including writing for 4 years on one of the all-time great hits of television, Roseanne. He was happily married with 8 children, but somehow he ended up homeless and divorced, trying to figure out how to rebuild his life. He tells his riches to rags story in his new book, Tell Me Something She Said. I am so glad to be talking with David Raether to hear about how this happened and how you fought back. All right, so tell me, you're writing for Roseanne, 11 years as a comedy writer, and you end up homeless. I know it's not a short story, but how did you go from one to the other?
Well, basically what happened was that in the early 2000s, it was clear that I needed to, I mean, television comedy writing is a very, can be a hard life. And I talk about this quite a bit in the book, but I had this enormous family, 8 children, and at a certain point, around 2002, I realized I needed to be at home more, spend time at home. So, we'd live below our means. We'd live below what we could have been living at, based on the salaries I was making. So I decided to take a couple of years off and just spend time with the family and with my wife. And then after a couple of years, I decided, well, I'm going to return to television. No problem, because I never had a problem.
It'd be easy, right? Yeah.
It'd be no problem. So what had happened was while I was gone, reality television hit. The sitcom business really plummeted, and by the time I came back, there were maybe 30, and over the next couple of years, it went down to 18. And the size of the staffs diminished dramatically, and I just was unable to find work. So, all right, so then let me fall back on my old career of magazine publishing executive, which I hadn't done that for 12 years. And the magazine business was kind of not the greatest business to be in anyway. So I had skills, the skill of writing jokes. It's not really transferable to any other business. It's really not a transferable skill. And my prior careers in magazine publishing and as a journalist were, more than a decade out in terms of experience. So I wasn't really current. So I spent a couple of years trying to get back into television, also looking for other jobs. Meanwhile, our savings is getting smaller and smaller, and I'm getting older and older. And so I'm just not the kind of, when you enter into your 50s and you're interviewing for, let's say, a web startup, you're sitting there talking to these people who graduated from college 3 weeks ago, and you look like their grandfather. You kids, stay off my lawn. They love to talk to you about, oh, I remember watching Roseanne when I was a little kid.
I was surprised they knew what Roseanne was. That was my
first.
I've
had a couple who said, I think I know that show. But, a lot of them, I remember that when I was a kid. My mom wouldn't let me watch it. I was in my 30s when I was doing that.
Yeah, isn't that with the guy with the Big Bang Theory? Wasn't he in there? And
exactly.
The guy from Monsters, Inc. I kind of remember, right?
Exactly. So, ultimately we just ran out of money. We lost I lost all my savings, lost the house.
You're right that you had $500,000 saved up. Is that correct?
Yeah.
And how many years did it take to go through $500,000?
6. With no money, with no income, it doesn't take long.
That's the actual number there, 6. Anybody wants to know, they have $500,000. So
yeah.
So,
well, we lost the house in 2006 and managed to move to an apartment with some of the kids, and my wife at the time and I did. I had a job, just doing jobs here and there. I was doing due diligence for a commercial real estate company, et cetera. And finally, in 2008, we didn't have anything left. We had no money left, and my wife and 2 younger daughters, for the summer, went up to San Francisco to stay with my 2 daughters who were renting an apartment in the Mission District. And so then I was just, because I just couldn't afford cheap hotels even anymore. And I became homeless. And next 18 months, I was homeless. And occasionally I'd get a gig through Craigslist that would cover, rent in a room in Pasadena. And then the gig would end, and then I couldn't afford rent anymore. And so then I'd have to go back out on the streets. And as it was tough.
How did it hit you the hardest?
Well, let's see. what happens is, well, I took the girls and Marina to the Greyhound bus depot in Glendale to send them up to San Francisco, and then, okay, it's 2 in the afternoon now. I have no place to go. I have no money. Wow, I'm screwed. And so then, when when that happens to you, you begin to realize that the things that you worried about before really not that important. The things that you start worrying about when you're homeless are really basic, simple things like, where am I going to sleep? What am I going to eat? Because I have no money. How am I going to clean myself? If, let's say, I get a job interview, and occasionally I would get an interview, and I had a storage facility that kept my clothes and stuff like that in. Okay, I've got clean clothes. How do I go to the interview without smelling? What do I do with my day? I'm sending out resumes. I'm not getting responses. I've got, I don't have family. I don't have tasks to do around the house. I have nothing. There's just nothing to do. And so it becomes this long, hard battle where basically what I used to say to myself is, I'm going to defeat this day. I'm going to beat it. I'm not going to stop. I'm just going to keep trying to make my life better, and I'm going to get through this. And so, but you think about yourself not in long-term plans, like, oh, how am I going to invest this money, or where am I going to, when should we, do this or that. You think about what is going to happen to me in the next 24 hours. What's going to happen in the next 12 hours? Where am I going to get something to eat? And what's it going to be? So you think about your life in very small increments, and you think about what is important in really basic terms. Food, sleep, cleaning yourself, things like that. Once you go through that and you come out of that, and you find yourself in a more stable situation, and you're able to rent a room on a long-term basis and things like that, there are two impacts on you. One is negative. You don't emerge from something like that without scars. You don't come out of that like, yay, I'm happy now. You come out of it sort of aware of yourself in different terms. And it makes certain relationships are more difficult. The good thing about what I went through is as I say in the essay, I discovered that I was less respectable than I thought of myself, but more resilient and more resourceful than I ever imagined. I have no doubts about myself.
You would go to Starbucks or a coffee shop or whatever and find a newspaper and, get through those hours and hope.
Yeah.
You figured out ways to make the hours work.
Yeah. I figured out ways to make the day go by. But also, the other thing is that on a psychological or I guess spiritual level, and there's another part of the book which is an excerpted in the essay, where I talk about hunger. And I said that of all the states of being that there is, whether it's ecstasy or joy or sexual desire or happiness, to me the most interesting thing I discovered was hunger. Because what happens, and I'm not talking about, I didn't eat lunch, I'm starving. I'm talking about after you go, several days without a meal, and you're just eating scraps, samples at grocery stores. What starts to happen is this sort of calm comes over you. But it's not a happy calm. It's just like, well, here I am. I may survive this, I may not. But this is what's happened to me. And it's a very interesting state of being. You stop worrying about stuff. You stop worrying about what you're going to eat. This is the Sermon on the Mount. What should we eat or what should we wear? Things like that. And you just become sort of calm, but you're not happy. It's not a happy calm. It's just a calm.
You mentioned that you helped get back into the workplace through Craigslist. You found gigs on Craigslist.
Yeah.
How did that work out for you? I mean, what you went from gig to gig? I mean, how did
Yeah,
you?
basically, you know, Craigslist, you can find real jobs, real professional jobs, or you can find like I had a job. I think I mentioned this in the essay. For a couple of years, off and on, where I was working as a ghostwriter for a retired Caltech professor who had aphasia and wanted to write his memoirs. Now,
Aphasia
writing
is
your memoirs
a disease, an illness where he couldn't move or he couldn't type.
Well, aphasia is an inability to communicate.
Right.
So he couldn't speak other than maybe 2 or 3 words at a time. If he tried to write something, it would basically look like scribbling, and he couldn't type. But his mind was still working. He could read, and he could edit. So we would send. Now imagine trying to write your memoirs when that's your situation. I mean, writing your memoirs is a difficult enough task anyway, because you don't want to come across as like, oh, I'm poor me or fascinating me. You know, it's and being unable to communicate made it even more difficult. So we would sit in his office and he would say, he was an expert on political geography, taught at Caltech, expert specifically on Africa. So, for instance, he would pull out a picture, and it would be Nelson Mandela and him standing next to each other. He'd go, him. And I'd say, Nelson Mandela. And he said, yes. So you want to tell me a story about Nelson Mandela? Yes. Is this something that happened recently? No. Well, did it happen when you were in Africa in the 50s? Yes. So it would go like that.
Wow,
and we ended up, you know, work a couple of hours every, 3-4 afternoons a week. And over 2 years, we produced a memoir. I'd have that job, and that would be enough to afford a room in some crummy part of Pasadena for $500 a month. And, so then gradually, you start having some, you start building up. I started to look for work in web content, and I would get occasional jobs doing web content, and then you have a portfolio, and then you can start sending off resumes to real jobs that are looking for guys who know how to blog, know, content management systems, things like that. So it was sort of, that was the incremental, slow building.
Is that what led back to a life now of employment? And you're living where now?
I'm living in Berkeley, California. And
are you working, or are you?
I'm working right now I'm blogging for a couple of places. I'm blogging mainly for a company called Degree.com, which is a self-education, lifelong learning website in the Bay Area. That's a very hot area right now, venture investment. So I'm blogging for them. I've done, I occasionally do work for other people. I do, private editing, copy editing gigs and stuff like that. So, it keeps the wolf from the door.
Are you ever going to go back to TV?
I can't imagine a circumstance under which I would go back to TV. First of all, I think TV doesn't want me, which fair enough. I can accept that. And the other thing is I would have to move, that would involve going back to Los Angeles, and I don't know that I'd want to do that. As much as I love LA and I think it's one of the great cities of the world, my time there is over.
Well, what about,
so
did you ever hear from, Tom Arnold got you the job on Roseanne.
Tom's been great to me. He's been very helpful to me over the last couple. When he found out what my situation was, he's been very wonderful to me. I adore Tom. I think he's a wonderful person, and he's been very good to me. And he's helped me in many ways. He's gotten me little rewrite jobs and things like that. So,
what made you decide to write a book? You wrote a book about this, and you have it available.
Well, what happened is I'm a good storyteller. I'll just say that. So I would come up from LA on these ride shares, and I would be talking to my girlfriend, and I'd tell her these stories. I'd tell them my family. Anyway, my girlfriend would say, geez, why don't you, this would be like a really funny book. Why don't you collect all these ride share stories and put them into a book? So I started doing that. I started writing up all these ride share stories. And then a thought occurred to me, well, I should probably explain why a 53-year-old man is using ride share to travel between Los Angeles and San Francisco. So once I decided to do that, then obviously that's a complicated story. So I started writing that, and about a year and a half ago, I started a blog in which I decided to speak honestly and directly about that I'd been homeless and what that experience was like, and just to see if I could write honestly about that, if I could write directly, and not, you know, shade the truth, but just to be really as honest as I could, to talk about things where, like, one time my son called me over to one of the houses he was staying at, and under the pretense that I needed to sign some papers for him for high school. And when I got there, he told me he had no papers to sign. He wanted me to just shower because I smelled. So I thought, okay, I'm just going to go for it and see what kind of reaction I get from friends of mine and just the general world of people who read blogs. And I was very moved by the reaction. Friends of mine were, you know, who knew nothing about it, were really shocked and upset. And also I started getting emails from people who were like, you know, I went through something like this myself. I was a successful real estate agent, or I was an attorney, and I went through homelessness. So I started thinking, okay, there may be something to this story. So after a couple of months, I shut down the blog. I was posting every day. I shut down the blog and decided to turn it into a book, which is a very different thing than a blog. So I rewrote, you know, edited, rewrote. I added additional chapters, and I produced this book. And well, then I was just living my life, working, whatever. And then about a year had gone by, and then I applied for a job with this web startup in the city in San Francisco called Priceonomics. And I sent, you know, I had to include writing samples, so I sent over, among other things, the book itself. I just figured, well, it's the best thing I've ever written. We'll see what he has to say. And the CEO called me up immediately, and he said, look, I'm not going to hire you for this job. You don't have a strong enough academic background to write about economics, but this book is fantastic. How can I get a copy of it? And I said, well, I haven't published it. And he said, why don't you self-publish it on CreateSpace with Amazon? Mm-hmm. I went, I don't know. And he said, I tell you what, why don't you write an essay based on the book? We'll publish that and include links to, you know, Amazon, so you can sell a few copies. So that's how I came to publish the book. The response to the Priceonomics essay has been unbelievable. It's had like 145,000 readers. There was an article published on it in a Dutch newspaper. And because I suddenly I'm getting emails from all these people in Holland saying, oh, I read your story. I was like, okay. I've received emails from people in China. I got an email from people in Ireland. I mean, people basically saying, I completely identify with your story. Mine is not quite as bad, or some were actually worse. But basically, what has struck me is since 2008, you know, people around the world, but particularly middle-class working people, have endured grave difficulties economically and just sort of quietly endured them. And this story seems to have resonated with those people, with people all over the world, actually. I mean, I didn't set out to, and it's sort of makes me feel weird to even say that I've got a story that resonates with people all over the world, but because I'm not that big a deal, really, seriously. But it's really seems to have, I mean, like I had an email from a woman, a working mother in Ireland, said she was reading the essay and she started crying.
That's how I came across you. Someone had posted the article on Facebook, and they're in the same situation. They were in the media for quite some time.
Sure.
And now they can't find work. And, you know, so what, I mean, what do you say to these people?
Most of the time I say ABC, always be courageous. I don't know what else to tell people. I mean, some of these stories are like so sad, they're just heartbreaking. And all you can say is, look, you know what? This is what your life is. You know, you just have to go forward. You can't stop. You can't, you know, you can't wallow, because you don't really have the ability to wallow. Wallowing is something that's available to you when you have a comfortable life.
Where do people get your book? Tell us about the book. And what does that mean? You get all the proceeds from the book, or?
They all go to the David Raether Foundation, which supports my rent. No, you can get it on Amazon.com. And you can either get it on paperback, which is print on demand, or a Kindle edition. So just go there. And
your website. Your website is David Raether, Raether.
Raether.com. And I have some excerpts from the book that you can read and then decide whether you want to spend the money, which, of course, you should.
Absolutely.
Like a decent person. Like a decent person would buy my book.
All right, and, so there's no, I mean, silver linings, or I mean, what do we go out here with? What is the message we take?
Well, is it? I'm good. I'm good. I'm doing well. I'm a happy person. I'm close to my children. You know, life is good. Life is beautiful. That's what you go out with. That's an old Serbian monk told me one time. I was complaining to him about how hard my life was, and he said, David, life is beautiful.
All right. The book's called Tell Me Something She Said. You can get it at Amazon, and you can find it. Also, read some excerpts at davidraether.com. You've been a pleasure. Thank you so much for sharing your story with us, David.
Well, thank you for having me, Mark.